Happy Valentine's Day, baby. I can't imagine life without you. You complete me. And I hope I complete you. Together.
I don't like that.
All right, well, let's do it again. Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony Back-to-Back Maddox. He's typing. He's not paying attention to me, folks.
I'm not paying attention. I'm trying to
Are
find
you
my
rotisserie
notes.
drafting? What are you doing?
No, I wish. Still gotta wait for my pick.
I kind of thought you were going to prioritize Graceful Restoration more highly.
I'm not splashing. I'm just playing two colors.
You're not splashing white?
No. Does it look like I'm splashing white?
I kind of assumed all along that you'd be playing some kind of white. You've got Chromatic Star, Chromatic Sphere. You've got all kinds of stuff to play white.
Just like those just do stuff.
Yeah, the stuff they do is fix your mana for like
No.
tiny
They
splashes.
say artifact, draw a card.
Okay.
That's all that matters.
All right, well, no time to get into the details of this Roto Draft, because instead we are discussing our personal cube additions from Phyrexia All Will Be One and Phyrexia All Will Be One Commander. This is the second of 3 cube set review episodes. The first was last week's mechanics overview. If you haven't listened to that episode, I would encourage you to check it out. But this week, Anthony, we are talking about these cards strictly in the context of our own personal cubes. I have additions here to the Bun Magic Cube and the Degenerate Micro Cube. Which of your cubes are you going to be trying some cards out in?
So I actually have very few cards from this set. One card for regular cube, although it sounds like you have a bunch of your own things that you want to recommend for regular cube.
Yes, I have questions about why you're not
great.
including certain cards.
I have a set of cards for new Untitled Cube project.
I see this is coming along a little bit. You've mentioned it in passing a little bit. It's turning from a pile of, shapeless cards to maybe something with a little more form.
A little bit, but mostly it's just like I keep saying, hey, there's all these cool like new artifact synergies, and like this isn't really something that's appropriate for my regular cube, but I kind of want to see some of these cards somewhere, so I just keep putting cards in this list and give it a couple months to bake, and maybe it'll turn into a cube.
So in this episode, we're talking about these cards very specifically in the context of something that Anthony might make in the future.
Yeah,
maybe.
this doesn't really work. But
No, it's fine.
The thing
It's
about
good.
cube is you don't need to be obligated to update every cube with every set. It's your own thing.
There are no
and
rules.
I'm chasing what is
No
interesting
rules.
me about these new sets, which is cards that don't fit in an environment they already have. I have 2 things for the Turbo Cube, and then I also just have a bunch of cards, which I suspect is going to be the things you're going to recommend for the regular cube that I think are interesting cards that I would think are worth mentioning, but I don't know if I'm actually going to put them into regular cube.
Okay, so you had 4 lists there, but only 2 are cubes, right? Just Turbo Cube and regular cube, and then
I'm doing my best. No,
it's fine. I'm just trying to get it all straight to decide who goes first and in what order. I think you should lead off then, and you can choose Turbo Cube or regular cube.
All right, I just want to talk about regular cube, and I only want to talk about one card, and it is. Should I talk about the regular cube?
Yeah, explain
First?
what it is, and then I'm going to see if what the card you mentioned is one of the 9 that I think are cool for your environment.
Okay, so
I identified.
This is my primary cube, and it's sort of a lower-powered cube. It plays a lot like a master set in terms of it's very much creature-focused. It's about getting things on the board, getting the most value out of your cards, and playing creatures and stuff.
A cube for lovers of limited, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while to sort of come up with some kind of hook for it. I feel like a lot of cubes have a headline that makes it very easy to understand what it's all about, and this cube is very much just like...
It's hard for that for your main cube. I mean, I still struggle with how to describe the Bun Magic Cube in a way that is pithy.
It's
So
tough.
it's my cube. It's the cards I like.
Yep, it's the cards I like, and it's like been through a lot of iteration to try and get the kind of gameplay I like. What do you think is my number 1 card?
There's a small spoiler, which is that you did hint in the last episode that you're not running any of the Skull Bombs, which probably would have been my guess in isolation if you had not told me that.
That makes sense.
Given that you have told me that, I think it's either Drown in Ichor or Whisper of the Dross.
It's actually Cankerbloom.
That was my third guess. I thought maybe a 2-mana 3/2 would be a little spicy for you.
So here's why I'm interested in this card, and I've actually talked specifically about why I don't love a lot of
Menu
modal
cards, yeah.
menu cards. So this is 2 mana for a 3/2, a creature, Phyrexian fungus, and it has 1 sacrifice Cankerbloom, choose 1, destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or proliferate. And I really don't love that menu kind of mechanic. It just isn't super resonant. But I do like a lot that's going on here specifically for this environment because I am trying to make green much more proactive. So I like having a 2-mana 3/2. It's not going to be the first 2-mana 3/2 in green in this environment. I've also been wanting to push a little bit more of the enchantment and artifact removal because there are relevant artifacts and enchantment. Fair amount of the removal there is based on enchantments and there is sort of an artifact theme. So I think it kind of gives green a little bit more of an identity there and something unique that it can do. And I also, as we talked about previously, like Proliferate a lot. There's a fair amount of things that just instantly make counters, so I think that this is going to be a thing that gets played for the removal aspect, but every once in a while it's going to come up that you want to Proliferate mid-combat or something, and I think that that's going to be a pretty cool card that's going to fit well in this context.
Yeah, I think it's good. That seems like a card that I think a lot of Cube designers are going to be excited about at all kinds of power levels, because the 3/2 body for 2 is good no matter what kind of Magic you're playing. I mean, in some environments, you don't really care about 2-drop creatures that are only a body anyway. But in those environments, you can remove problematic combo artifacts and enchantments. So I think this one will be pretty much a hit across the board.
It's also got just a really cool fungus on it, which I'm always a fan of.
It does have a fungus. I should have taken that into consideration. That was one of the 9 cards I had identified.
Okay.
But I had it lower because of the modal menu style card, which I know you are historically
That makes sense.
Against.
I mean, it is a negative, but whenever you're evaluating a card, it's like all of these factors add up, and I think that just it playing in multiple spaces that I do really want to push for green just kind of puts it over the edge.
I think we should talk about all the cards that I identified for the regular cube now instead of doing that later.
I would love to, and I'm going to just put them on the list, and we can think about it.
To be clear, none of these are like, you should be running this or whatever. Frankly, I think it's, I'm really invested in your queue. I think you should be honored that every time I look at the set, I don't think you've ever been like, I found 4 cards in this set that Bun Magic Cube be interested in, because you don't care. It's a stupid cube you don't like. Anyway.
Yep, that's right. I just don't care. I mean, I think that this is also kind of a novel environment that I think we're both kind of tuned into regular cube cards. Like, there is a vibe that I just really like these kinds of very simple effects that are clear and, have lots of opportunities to key off of other abilities. There's just a style to regular cube cards that I think we're both attuned to some degree.
Also, we're in the middle of a rotisserie draft, so, my eye to the regular cube is maybe a little more... My third eye is even more open now than usual. I already mentioned it. We got to talk about the Skull Bomb cycle. These we mentioned in the mechanics overview episode, but these are basically a callback to the Spell Bomb cycle. They are more little dinky artifacts that you can play and just use to draw a card, or you can pay a little bit of colored mana and get an effect. These differ from the Spell Bombs in that when you activate the ability for an effect, you also get to draw a card. I think any of them could be reasonable fits in your environment. The ones I thought you'd be most interested in are the white and blue ones. So the white one is 1 generic mana for an artifact, and you can pay 1 and sacrifice it to draw a card, or you can pay 2 and a white to give target creature you control +2/+2 and flying until end of turn and draw a card. Activate only as a sorcery. And the blue one is basically just a a side-graded Aether Spellbomb, where you can still return a creature to its owner's hand, but instead of Aether Spellbomb just bouncing the creature or drawing a card, this one has a more expensive activated ability to bounce the creature, 2 and a blue, but if you do that, you also get to draw a card. This one you can activate only as a sorcery, though, which maybe is why you're not excited about it.
I mean, a lot of people will look at that and say that's a downside, but I think having onboard tricks can sometimes be not that much fun. It can lead to confusing gameplay, so just being like, yeah, this is a proactive card, you're only going to use it, to not surprise your opponent, but to shift combat. I mean, I think what's really cool about these is they are really easy to include in a deck. There's lots of opportunities for them to key off other things that care about all kinds of stuff, whether it's drawing extra cards or casting spells. And they also kind of enable this, being easy to include, but then having effects that you might not otherwise include that still come up in games and create a lot more novel game situations that you wouldn't otherwise look for designing your decks. And they're also really easy to splash. You can just put this in a deck where you have a couple blue sources, for example, and every once in a while you'll have it and be able to use this, but if you can't, you just cycle it, and that's fine. So,
all things you really like.
These really do stand out as regular cube cards. I'm dragging them all in from one bucket to the other, and... So here's another maybe relevant piece of context. I recently did just bump up this cube to 450 cards to support... a bigger pool of players to support 10 drafters.
Not a huge bump up because you were already at 420-ish, 415-ish, so...
Yeah. And so now I'm in a new space. I used to just be like, this is a floating, flexible number. I'll just throw in some new cards we want, but I can't shuffle it if it gets that much bigger.
So now you're actually sticking to rigidly 450?
Possibly. I'm between a rock and a hard place, or, the wanting to have at least enough for 10 players and wanting it to not be too big that I can shuffle, but maybe I will just... not worry about finding cuts for these and just put them in.
I already mentioned the next two, which is 2 black removal spells that both give -X till end of turn, and they both proliferate. One is Drown in Ichor, which is 1 and a black to give a creature -4/-4 at sorcery speed and proliferate. And one is Whisper of the Dross, which is 1 mana, 1 black mana, at instant speed to give a creature -1/-1 till end of turn and proliferate. I thought for sure at least one of these would make it in. I mean, like, you're playing Lava Coil, you're playing things like Fungal Infection, you like these cards that have additional upside, you like cards with additional proliferate like Volt Charge. Why neither of these?
I have no good reason.
You don't need a good reason. You can say, I just don't like them. Shove off.
You know, I do like them, though. So maybe I should rethink a little bit. I mean, I like instant speed removal a lot, so I think that maybe is the biggest knock against Drown and Ichor. I feel like that just opens up a lot of interesting lines of play, but like we just said, also
I was about to say, it's funny that you say that about removal, but the limitation on the activated abilities of the spell bombs, you're like, I like that it's sorcery speed only.
I'm not... It's complicated.
I think Lava Coil's in a great spot in your cube because it is, I think, a little above rate, and for that above rate, you have to cast it at sorcery speed. And I think Drown in Ichor is exactly the same way. -4/-4, I mean, it's exactly the same rate as Lava Coil. It's going to kill pretty much everything. I would love this over, like, a Murder. I think it's a power level upgrade. Maybe you don't like that it's a power level upgrade.
Sure.
Maybe Murder's too, like, simple and clean for you to want to cut it.
It's really iconic. I do like it, but I definitely agree Murder's not a card I take very highly in this environment.
Yeah. So I don't know. Those jumped out at me. It seems like a cool way to make the +1/+1 counters matter a little more. Like, you've had Windy Constrictor in this cube forever. Has it ever done anything?
Not so much, no. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, how in this environment right now, the green color pairs a lot of them are struggling a little bit in terms of, like, what's their identity, and the gold cards aren't necessarily great signposts right now, so that's a bigger issue I should think about on another episode.
And not to talk about here. Next up, there are 2 combat tricks that jumped out at me, because you're a person that enjoys combat tricks. One is Tyvar's Stand. X and a green for an instant. Target creature you control gets +X till end of turn and gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Baseline, green mana, hexproof, indestructible, so save your thing from getting removed. Upside could make a thing potentially huge in the late game. How does this compare to, like, I know you're on Blossoming Defense, you're on some other sort of protective combat trick style effects. How does this compare to those in your head?
That's a great question. I mean, this does seem very much similar. I think what I don't love about this is just the potential for it to be super swingy and just end a game out of nowhere. Just being able to basically
You're playing
bane fire
Run
your
Hydra.
opponent. True, but you gotta attack with that. You get to untap, you get a turn.
No. I'm saying the discard ability on
discard
Ren's Run
one.
Hydra is exactly this, except it's a permanent boost.
That's true. All right, you got me. I'm trapped. You win.
I'm just curious. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you have a lot of things in this environment that care about power.
True.
And that's a thing you kind of like as a little sub-theme, so that pump is not necessarily just a removal spell style.
But here's the thing.
pump.
You cast this on your Dreadhorde Arcanist, and then what? You can't cast this out of the graveyard for any meaningful effect. That's not totally true, because it does still give the hexproof indestructible.
Yeah, you could target another creature with a hexproof indestructible if you
Interesting.
wanted to.
Okay, we're learning a lot.
Anyway, it just seemed like kind of a bit of a pushed rate for this kind of effect. I mean, obviously the raw efficiency of something like Blossoming Defense is much better. You get the boost and the hexproof and indestructible. But in some ways, to me, that's actually like more swingy, because when you get to benefit off of both of those effects, it's like a huge blowout for only 1 mana. Whereas here, it's like the baseline is fine. You'll save your thing, your Trickle Heroic for only 1 green. But then it has this like growing upside where you can decide where you want to cast it and what value you want to get off of it. I don't think I would take it super howie, though, for what it's worth. But just something that jumped out at me. Another one that seems kind of pushed me, but in a weird way, is Blazing Crescendo. 1 and a red for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+1 till end of turn, and you may exile a top card of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. Which, until the end of your next turn, is basically a cantripping combat trick here with a little bit of information your opponent gets available to them. I really love the cantripping combat tricks, right? Like, for the heroic deck, I want Expedite so much more than I want any other...
Or Fists of Flame.
Or Fist of Flame is a really good one. I like the ones that draw me a card because I don't want to just have, like, one big all-in turn where it's like, okay, I'm going to, like, pump this by 4 and, you know, get 1 attack in and be, like, way negative on card advantage and hope I get to, like, blow you out of the water. I love Expedite because it still lets me trigger my thing. I get to do the heroic thing. I get to loop it with Feather. I get to connive with Illuminated Virtuoso. But also I get to, like, keep the cards flowing and not fall way behind if they do remove my creature or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think more importantly to me, it's like we do have this heroic theme, which is kind of an A-B mechanic, and that's a little bit rough because if you draw only one half of it, you're kind of in a tough spot. But the fail case on Expedite is so much lower because you do have the opportunity just to essentially cycle it when you...
and even when it doesn't fail, it keeps you drawing more stuff so that you draw more of your enablers and more of your payoffs.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, again, I don't have a good answer. I think that this does make sense. It sort of fits the environment, but, you know, I guess I'm just in a situation where I'm not interested in making changes just for the sake of making changes. And whereas I think Cankerbloom is a card that is pushing something that I do want to push, pushing a couple things that I want to push, these feel a little bit more interchangeable compared to effects that are already there. Which is, you know, it's a really difficult thing to be maintaining a cube at this sort of like weird floating power level as opposed to pursuing playing the most powerful cards, because it's very easy to look at a new set and say, what are the most powerful cards that are here? Are they better than any of the cards that I already have? And making decisions that way, just you have something to point to justify things. I'm just kind of like, yeah, these are more cards. A lot of these things could fit. They could be fine, but it's just a question of, are they sparking joy or are they like doing something deliberately that is novel?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why when I look at a set like this, I'm picking out a bunch of cards for the regular cube. There are way more potential candidates on power level than there are for other cubes we've talked about before. In the case of a Blazing Crescendo, though, like that kind of card along with the Expedites and the Fist of Flames, that's kind of the only thing that will make me excited to play the heroic deck. And so having those over something like a Borrowed Hostility or...
That's a good point. I could see that swap.
This next one, I'm not surprised you're not into, but it kind of struck me as belonging to a category of card that I see you playing often, which is kind of like slightly below top tier spells matter payoffs, where like the best of the best, you're like not interested in that. Well, I mean, you do have Young Pyromancer, but that scales a lot with the environment. But a lot of the sort of best of the best spells matter payoffs you tend to avoid, but you have some things like, you know, Gutter Snipe and Thermo Alchemist and things that still reward you for playing that spells matter deck, but are not the cream of the crop. And I thought Sawblade Scamp was kind of interesting in that regard. This is 1 red for a creature Phyrexian Beast. It's a 1/1 with haste. When you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and you can remove an oil counter from Sawblade Scamp to have it deal... tap and remove an oil counter from Sawblade Scamp to have it deal 1 damage to each opponent. Another 1-drop that is flexible in the late game. It gives you some sort of value. When you can't attack with it anymore, you can just start stacking counters up on it and then using it to shoot people. It just kind of felt like it was in this weird space. And I want to call it out, too, because I think it's a good example of a card that... Even if you have no other oil counters, right, this is just an entirely self-contained card. That counter could be any kind of counter. It doesn't matter. It just works with itself, and so it's not in any way parasitic or anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine card. It's kind of like just a 1-mana 1/1 unblockable forever, but you do need to have enough non-creature spells to fuel it. I think it would play fine here, but it doesn't really spark joy for no reason I can explain.
Okay, here's the last one.
You have another.
Yeah, I had two left.
Okay.
This one I'm not that surprised you're not running. This one I'm also not surprised you'd identify, but this one, of all these cards, I'm actually going to make a little bit of a case for. Like, I would love to see this one here. And that is Malcator, don't know how you pronounce his name. The Purity Overseer. It's 1 white-blue for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Elephant Wizard. Okay, that part's a little ridiculous. It's a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. So it is in the same spirit as all of the Splicers from the past. And at the beginning of your end step, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, you make another 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. I think this is pushed on power level for the regular cube, but in a way that I think is awesome for gold cards, and exactly the thing that will pull you into a gold color combination. I don't know if you're looking for more blue-white gold cards, but compare this to something like Wrath or something, which I feel like Wrath is never a pull to be in blue-white. It's like, if you are blue-white, you'll probably wheel it and get it, 13th pick, and you can just put Wrath in your deck if you want to, or it doesn't even make the main deck. This would be a genuine pull for me to like play an Artifacts Matter deck, which I think right now is good when it comes together, but oftentimes feels like you don't get there, and you kind of are playing this janky, some combination of Esper deck with like not enough synergies to really matter.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a cool card. I like that it kind of does two things. It's both an Artifact Matters card. It's also potentially a Blink card. And that's what I think
the other thing I was going to mention about it.
Is actually going to be a lot more powerful in the regular cube because there are ways to blink it. So I think that that'll be kind of the main mode.
Make me take Whitemane Lion higher.
True. So for me, I do think that this is maybe just a little bit overpowered. And I think another big thing I want in this environment is cards that are powerful to take some amount of investment. And I think just the floor on this is so high that it's not really a card that takes that investment. So I think that, if you twisted any of the numbers a little bit here, it could make more sense to me.
In that case,
so here's what I'm going to do.
Well,
I'm going to drag it from this bin down to new Untitled Cube project. How about that?
I'm not happy with that. Here's what I'm going to argue. I think it's a perfectly valid argument. I totally get that perspective in the game. I think it's one of the great things about the regular cube. Cut Restoration Angel for this.
Oh.
Restoration Angel, better on the floor. Also really good with this card. It'd be kind of a problem to curve this into Restoration Angel. And this is more of a build around the Restoration Angel, certainly is.
True.
And has, I think, a worse floor as a base rate. I think it's pretty cool.
Maybe I should. I mean, there's a lot of factors, again, that go into any individual card, and Restoration Angel really fails the take some investment aspect of that.
Every single one of us have cards in our cube that, do not really align with our stated goals because we just like them for whatever reason, right? Like
it's an iconic card.
None of us are perfectly logically consistent with our cube curation. And that would be boring if you were, honestly.
I think even if we say we are being consistent, it's just there are a lot of factors. And the fact that the card is iconic, the fact that people enjoy casting it, it's powerful, but people don't necessarily get frustrated by it. Like, these are all things that add up to it.
I get frustrated by
it. Okay, this is data.
I get frustrated by it when I have 6 spells in my hand that can deal 3 damage to something, but nothing that can deal 4.
For some reason, every point of toughness in this environment matters a lot.
The jump from 3 to 4 is almost monumental.
And 2 to 3 is huge.
Yeah, at lower mana values it is.
Yeah.
I think 3 to 4 is where it's like, oh, this goes from a good threat to like a thing I maybe can't answer at all in my entire deck. Whereas 2 to 3 is like, played early, this is going to change combat math and stuff like that. But I love talking about the regular cube, as you can tell. And this card jumped out at me as a cool way to make the blue-white artifacts deck just that much more appealing and come together that much more often. It's also a legendary creature Phyrexian Elephant Wizard. So there's something to be said for that,
That's
too.
a really good point. It really that adds a lot of value.
Here's another thing you could do, which, I think oftentimes it's very easy as a cube designer to overly focus on edits. You can put it in for a couple drafts, and if you don't like it, put Restoration Angel back in, right? Like, you can always just try it out. Or not. I'm here pitching my Malcutter. I'm pitching my boy over here, but you could also just say, nah, screw it. I don't want to. It's my cube.
Phyrexian Elephant Wizard. All right, so I have 2 potential inclusions for the Turbo Cube, and I should actually
Anthony,
say...
what's the Turbo Cube?
All right, so the Turbo Cube is a really simple regular cube, except for one twist, which is all spells and abilities that you activate cost 2 generic mana less to cast. So it's kind of just a weird, combo-y focused environment. One of the really fun things about it is just you open your pack and you get to reevaluate a bunch of cards that, like, was some kind of junk rare or some junk common in some set you forgot about.
I think that is unequivocally the most thing fun thing about it. It's great.
And it's challenging to make that reevaluation, but it is a lot of fun. So there are a couple cards that would be totally easy includes. We already mentioned the Spell Bombs. I could definitely throw them in there.
Every single one of those would be fine because they all just cycle for free.
Yeah, extremely powerful free cyclers. I feel like where the environment is at, that's not what we want more of right now. Like, there's just a lot of that.
Well, speak for yourself.
I mean, I want in my deck as a player,
right.
I'm taking those effects very, very highly.
I think you've come to this place where there are enough things that are like free to borderline broken that you get to really choose the ones that do something interesting enough for their free effect. And are any of these interesting enough? I would think maybe the black one that has the raised dead is perhaps the most interesting.
Yeah, most likely to actually be relevant in games, especially if you have like critical combo pieces.
That or things that self-sacrifice, like that could have a high upside where it's really worth paying that black mana symbol, which you do have to pay to get the thing back and keep going. But I could totally see skipping these just because they're kind of interchangeable, and 98% of the time are just going to be free cyclers that trigger artifact cast stuff, which there's so many of those, you don't need to include them all. It's just not that fun.
Right. So the cards that I'm interested in are, first up, Blade of Shared Souls. This is 2 and a blue for an artifact equipment. It has 4 Mirrodin! Exclamation point.
Mirrodin!
Thank you. I can't pronounce it correctly with my accent. It enters the battlefield, it creates a 2/2 guy, and you attach the sword to the guy. And then whenever Blade of Shared Souls becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you may have it copy another creature you control, and it is equipped for 2.
And it enters and attaches, so you do get to copy a thing the turn you cast it,
correct.
Right?
So it's sort of just like a 3-mana clone for one of your own creatures, but you have the option to move that equipment around. And in the context of the Turbo Cube, this only costs 1 blue, and the equip is free. So I don't think this is going to be a super, super powerful card.
I don't know.
But
it has to me, Mirage Mirror vibes, which is a card that I think people have been a little low on because very often in this cube, your decks consist of a lot of enablers and a few very important payoffs, and getting to double your payoff, like getting to make this another copy of Monastery Mentor or another copy of Devilish Valet or another copy of whatever, is so huge that I think the power level is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what I enjoy about this card in this context is this is one of those cards that's really fun to reevaluate and just sort of think, hold up, the equip is free, so I can potentially be moving this around multiple times a turn and getting different effects. Maybe I turn some creature into a...
Turn it into a Tyrus Tracker, get your clue token, sacrifice the clue
yeah.
token, draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then turn it into a copy of Monastery Mentor and cast some non-creature spells you just drew. Like, yeah, you could do some kind of messed up stuff.
And I also just think this is a really interesting card that, even if you did have to pay mana for it, I'm pretty excited about the sort of potential kinds of things you could do with it, so I'm excited to have a place to put it.
I agree, cool card.
All right, and the second card I have I'm a little bit more skeptical about, but Slobad Iron Goblin is 2 and a red for a 3/3 legendary creature, Phyrexian Goblin Artificer. Get some long type lines here, and it has sacrifice an artifact, add an amount of red equal to the sacrifice artifact's mana value, spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activated abilities. This is a cool idea because it only costs 1 red. If you untap with it, you can make a bunch of mana that you can then dump into more artifact spells. That's true. It's kind of explosive, but because the ways that you can actually spend that mana is a little bit narrow in this context, because so many of the things that you are playing are just kind of free, it's maybe almost more of a build around. What do you think about this?
I think I suggested this initially when this card was spoiled in the in our Playgroup's Discord channel. I don't think it's going to be fantastic, but I think the potential is there because it's true that a lot of things are free, and so you can think of stuff that produces a decent amount of mana as like a sort of build around because you need somewhere to spend that mana. But it's also true that when you're going off, very often the choke point is mana to actually cast the few spells you need to cast to actually keep things going. And this is a card I think has potential. The other reason I called this out is because I've always wanted more artifact sacrifice outlets in this cube. I feel like there are a decent number of artifacts that either have value when they're sacrificed, like the Wellsprings, or more importantly, I'm able to like get back from my yard with Scrap Trawler or like Mere Retriever, but I can't put them in the yard in any way. I just want to rebuy them by putting them in the yard so I can play an Archaeum Ender and then get the effect again. So being able to sacrifice for value, I think, is a big part of this card's positives.
Yeah, and we should say, you get the discount on the spells, but the mana cost is still the same. So if you play your 2-mana Wellspring, it costs nothing to cast it, but then you get 2 red mana when you sacrifice it.
Exactly, yeah. So you're still going to get mana off of this thing. It does seem very good with stuff like Retrofitter Foundry, where you have mana to spend on those activated abilities. True. That's going to make a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's an interesting, maybe we'll get there card. I don't think it's a slam dunk in terms of power level. I don't think people are going to be like thrilled about it, but I think it can do stuff sometimes.
Yeah, the other thing I do like about it is that similar to the Blade of Shared Souls, it is a card that is fun to read and try and reevaluate and figure out if it is going to be powerful. So even if it's not, a great all-star that's going to perform in a lot of decks, it might be worth it just for being a pretty novel card in this environment.
Yeah. I didn't do a close read of this set for the Turbo Cube because I got overwhelmed by how many artifacts there were, so we're going to trust that you found all the good ones.
There are definitely some others. I mean, we mentioned the spell bombs. I have a saved search that includes, all things that cost 2 generic mana or 2 generic mana and a 1 pip or have activated abilities. It is pretty quick to take a thorough look through a set here. But if I did miss something, let us know.
All right, since you did the Turbo Cube, I want to do my totally broken, unfair cube with a slight rules modification, which is the Degenerate Micro Cube. This is a cube where the rules are modified so that you draft from smaller pools, 2 packs of 12 currently, and then you build a deck with a minimum size of 15 cards, which is obviously a lot smaller. And within those restrictions, I have pursued pretty much all the most broken things you can do in Magic because you can actually run 2-card combos and very reliably find them when your deck is that small and you start with half of it in your hand.
It's interesting you talk about this as being an environment with rules changes. I almost feel like stuff like deck size and like the pack size, stuff like that. Like we change those kinds of things all the time just based on the number of players we have for a draft.
It feels like less of a change than the Turbo Cube, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's really not it's a big change because you're dialing it to an extreme, but what I think is actually the more significant change is just that you don't lose from decking. So it allows you to play your decks very differently within this tweaked deck size. That
does make a certain subset of cards that would otherwise not be interesting at all pretty powerful. But I have two cards here that I immediately jumped out at me that I don't actually think are good enough that I think are worth mentioning. One is Minor Misstep. It's a blue mana for an instant, counter target spell with mana value 1 or less.
Oh no, did they actually fix Mental Misstep?
Well, I mean, it's fixed in quite a few ways. Mainly being you have to actually pay blue mana to cast it. Yeah, this is a callback to Mental Misstep. Mental Misstep is in the Degenerate Micro Cube and is quite good because it allows you to counter all kinds of stuff for just 2 little life in any color deck. You don't have to be playing blue to do it. And at first I was like, this seems pretty interesting until I realized that this does not counter the spells that have alternative casting costs that make them free. You can't counter a Force of Will or whatever with this, and there are a lot of those spells in this cube. So it's not going to counter your Pitch Elementals, it's not going to counter your Force of Wills, your Force of Negations, whatever. And so given that it doesn't counter that, it's really just countering 1-mana spells or free stuff like Mana Crypt, basically. And there I don't think it's quite good enough for a blue mana. I'm always looking at any 1-mana or cheaper counter spells for this environment, but I don't think this has quite enough hits for this to matter.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you want your cards to matter in your cube, so that's a big factor.
And this next card, as I was reading it from top to bottom, I could just my face was lighting up. I was getting more and more excited. And then I got to the power and toughness line. It's Soulless Jailer, 2 generic mana for an artifact creature, Phyrexian Golem. It's a bit of a hate bear. Permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. But it's a 0/4.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting in this environment because I feel like the Hate Bears deck, as you were talking about earlier, it's trying to shut down your opponents doing really broken stuff, but then it also needs a way to win the game, which is often just like attacking with a random 2/1, and this is an 0/4.
I have wanted another threat for the Shops deck. Shops is one of my favorite decks in this cube. Again, like, you can build an entire deck around exactly one land because you start with half your deck in your hand, so a lot of games you're going to have Mishra's Workshop in your opening hand. And this is a perfect kind of card for that deck, except it literally can't kill your opponent, which is so annoying. If it was a 1/3, or if it was even a 1/1, I'd be more excited about it than an 0/4 for this environment. Because a lot of games do come down to just like, okay, you answered all my stuff, now you have to actually kill me. And having one more thing that can threaten to kill your opponent is so important. It's worth noting that things it shuts down are somewhat narrower than maybe it looks like. I mean, it shuts down Reanimator, obviously, and stuff like, Snapcaster Mage and things like that. Yeah, if it would just have any kind of power, I'd be real excited about it, but it do not.
Is this card designed this way for some very specific constructed reason?
Cascade.
I feel like it's... but I mean, does the fact that it also is an 0/4 mesh with like something else that's happening?
It's a Cascade hate card you can't bolt.
Doesn't die to Lightning Bolt.
Well, you don't play Bolt in your Cascade decks anyway, so I don't know. It's definitely, I think, a like silver bullet against Cascade in Modern is what I read it as.
Sure.
I could be wrong about that, but that's what it reads like to me. All right, then 2 cards I actually am interested in playing in the cube, and I should note this is remarkable. I mean, this is a very small cube that is playing just the most powerful broken cards, so most sets come and go, and there are no cards I'm interested in. I'm like, yep, sorry, nothing is better than one of the best 180 cards already in Magic's existence. But this time we have 2 that I think are interesting. One is Sheoldred's Edict. 1 and a black for an instant, and you choose 1. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature token, or each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. In unfair environments, edicts get a lot better because there are threats that you can put into play that have protection from other types of removal. They can't be targeted, they're indestructible, whatever. Making your opponent sacrifice them and being able to get around any sort of hexproof or shroud, I think, is very valuable. This answers things like, Emrakul, which has protection from colored spells. You can just target your opponent and make them sacrifice it. So edicts are already good in that environment, and I have a couple in there already, and I think this is maybe arguably better than one of the ones I'm already running. Even if it's not better on power level, though, I think I kind of like the play patterns of this more than, for example, right now, I am on Sudden Edict, which is the Edict with Split Second. And Split Second does really matter here, but it's not fun.
Yeah.
I mean, Split Second is never fun.
And you can tell this card is fun by the flavor text. It says, "Congratulations, I am entertained."
There you go. So basically, I think it might take the space over Liliana's Triumph or Sudden Edict. I do have Liliana Planeswalker, so Liliana's Triumph gets a little boost there. But
is that something you actually have seen happen in games?
Yeah, for sure.
Neat.
Yeah. I mean, again, the decks are small. You have your Liliana's Triumph. You're very often going to get to do them both. So I'm looking at maybe taking one of those out for this. I might even swap out another card possibly, but there's definitely a density of edicts at which point they're not that good anymore. Something I have learned from the Neoclassical Cube and from playing the Old Border Cube at CubeCon, there are so many more tokens now than there used to be in Magic. I mean, tokens go all the way back to Alpha, but there are so many more. Like, the old Border foil cube didn't have any attempt to specifically limit tokens, right? It was just like, here are the cards within this restriction that I can play that are making the gameplay I want. And just by coincidence, I think it has like 7 or 8 different tokens the entire cube is capable of making, and the chances you have more than 2 in a deck is basically nil. So it really shows me how a card like Diabolic Edict, the original Edict that everyone calls these cards edicts because of, that card used to be pretty good. I mean, it was an iconic card back in the day, and now most people would agree it's kind of unplayable even in limited, right? Like, just giving your opponent the choice is so bad. And one of the reasons it's so bad is because there are so many cards now that just give you a dinky little incidental token, and then now you can't actually get rid of everything that matters. And so I think this is going to be relevant for a lot of cubes, and the fact that you can also make this just an edict for a planeswalker, like, do we even have just a regular edict for a planeswalker? I'm not sure we do.
I don't think so.
There's quite a few that say sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker, but I don't think there's one where you can just say target opponent sacrifices a planeswalker, and that's part of this card.
Isn't there Angrath's something or other?
Oh, yeah, that one, I guess you could choose Planeswalker, yeah. But this just seems better than that, so I think this card is going to be interesting for a lot of cubes, and the Degenerate Microcube is one of them. It is.
I think it's interesting to reflect on the fact that you just said that you're only interested in playing like the 180 most powerful cards in the history of Magic.
I mean, but you know, that's a simplification, but sure.
But I think that the fact that that is a simplification is relevant and interesting, because this card would be pretty bad, I think, in my main cube, in regular cube, and I think it's worth highlighting that just the context really, really matters, and there isn't necessarily an objective best 180 cards, because as soon as you recontextualize things perform differently.
It would certainly be better than any other edict ever printed.
Yes, it would still be the best edict, because the token thing is a big part of why edicts get less powerful. But,
right,
but still.
But there you always be choosing to make them sacrifice a non-token, pretty much. You don't have any really high-value tokens. There's no, like, you know, big stuff floating
around. There could
be,
one Voice of Resurgence token that could happen, possibly. But it's unlikely.
Well, if they have a Voice of Resurgence token,
they probably have a lot of other tokens.
You're probably in a big problem anyway. So yeah, I think it's interesting. It's like, you know, an edict for the modern era. I think it actually will play kind of like Diabolic Edict did back in the day.
Interesting, yeah.
Because now we actually have more kinds of threats and there's so many more tokens. Now it actually still gives you the kind of choice that it plays, kind of like the role that Diabolic Edict used to play when it was actually playable. The last card here for the Degenerate Microcube is the card I'm most excited about across all of my cubes from this new set, and I'm very excited about it, Anthony. Do you want to guess? You can say no, I don't want to guess. This is boring and stupid. Why do you put me on the spot like this?
I'm not going to be able to guess without looking at the list. Which isn't loading. Give me a second while I filter out the 30,000 ridiculous booster fun cards.
While you're looking up, I'm going to see if there's a cool printing of this card that I can possibly get.
I'm just going to give up.
The card is the Mycosynth Gardens.
Okay, I was not going to guess that.
This is a land. It's a sphere. It taps for a generic mana. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So far, it's just like a pretty bad common fixing land we see in some sets. But then it has this activated ability. Pay X and tap it. The Mycosynth Gardens becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. This actually fills that role of another threat in the Shops deck in exactly the way I was hoping that something like Soulless Jailer would. Being able to make copies of your artifacts at instant speed if they are threatened with removal or something is going to be huge. I mean, even just the curve of, you know, playing a Lodestone Golem, then making this another Lodestone Golem the turn after is going to be really pretty disgusting. It is worth noting that obviously, well, not obviously, people don't play with the card Mishra's Workshop. Mishra's Workshop taps for 3 generic mana, but you can only use it to cast artifact spells, not activate abilities of anything. So I won't be able to use my Mishra's Workshop to pay into this activated ability, which is a slight nerf and worth noting. So I won't always be able to copy the thing I was able to cast because I'm getting mana from a land that can't be used to put mana into this thing. But the fact that this is uncounterable, it puts a thing into play that you can do at instant speed and can make a second copy of very key cards that are obviously all singleton in this environment, I think makes it a staple moving forward. I'm really excited about it.
Interesting. So it becomes a copy of that thing permanently, and it loses its ability to tap for mana, correct? It's
Pretty
no
sure,
longer
yeah.
this land. It's an interesting card.
Yeah. Just a land for a little while, just a waste for a little while, then becomes, you know, a Worm Coil Engine or a... I'm just excited to, like, you know, play a Chalice of the Void on 1 and then make a copy of it to make it a Chalice of the Void on 0. And then now, what are you going to do? I don't even have to pay any mana for that.
Does that actually work? I feel like
it does
Chalice...
work.
Ooh, rude.
The copy obviously won't have any counters on it, so that will just counter 0 mana event spells. So it's like 2 different Chalices now. that will counter different kinds of spells.
Yeah, there's some cards that say, choose a number, and if the number wasn't chosen, then you just get nothing, right?
Yeah, but Chalice counters
It
equal the
actually
number of
just
counters on it.
Number of counters, yeah. Cool.
So I'm really pumped about the Mycosynth Gardens. I think this card is very, very cool, and I'm just now looking up, is there a really cool version of it I can get for the Degenerate Micro Cube? Internet does seem kind of slow, huh?
You can get the
There's
widescreen.
not. Just regular and widescreen. Also, I don't really like the art that much. Oh well, it's not sparking joy artistically, but I think the card is going to be really fun to play with, and I think there is a deck in this cube that can just win with lands. The only threats are Urza Saga, Mishra's Factory, and something like this can be really good. Obviously, you can't make another copy of your Urza Saga token, but this can become another one of your hate pieces. Then you just fill your deck with things that says people can't cast spells, and you don't bother casting spells. You just kill them with your lands. Future Andy here. So we recorded this episode pretty far in advance, and I did miss a card that I think is definitely worth consideration in the Degenerate Micro Cube. That's the Filigree Sylex. It's 2 generic mana for a legendary artifact. You can tap it to either put an oil counter on it, or sacrifice it and destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on it, or remove 10 oil counters from among permanents you control and sacrifice it to deal 10 damage to any target. This is very similar to a card that's already in the Degenerate Micro Cube called Ratchet Bomb, and the difference here is that it's legendary and it has this last mode of being able to do 10 damage to things, and it's got, oil counters instead of charge counters, but they're effectively exactly the same. This also fills that slot of a win condition for a prison-style deck or an artifacts-based deck. It's just a Ratchet Bomb that if you don't need to Ratchet Bomb anything, you can just tick it up over the course of 10 turns, give yourself some inevitability, deal at least 10 damage. It's not a full 20 damage. I'm not actually convinced that this is going to stick around forever, because even if you are winning games this way, it doesn't sound particularly fun. I'd much rather be attacking somebody with a 1/1 over and over again than taking up the oil counters in my Filigree Sylex. So I don't know, but it is, in this context, pretty much a strict upgrade over Ratchet Bomb. So on power level, I think it's worth testing. I also don't like the art, though, so, you can't win them all. That's it for the Degenerate Micro Cube. Like I said, really excited about the Mycosynth Gardens. I think that card's going to be very cool, and Sheoldred's Edict is a cool side grade maybe to one of the other removal spells I'm running that I think might be worth it. It's so much better in fair context than Sudden Edict. And some games do come down to fair games, right? For as unfair as this environment is, sometimes you both stop your opponent's unfair thing, and you're kind of playing regular Magic, where you're attacking with creatures and blocking and whatnot, and they're being able to remove their Oko or whatever could make a huge difference. Let's hear the cards for your Untitled Cube project.
All right, so I've sort of been tinkering away with a new cube, and kind of the short version is just, like we've talked about, been really dialed into this very specific, pretty narrow power band for regular cube, and that's fun. I'm really happy with this cube, but I'm also excited to sort of explore a little bit of a different space. So really the short is just, I want to try doing a very similar thing, but kind of taking the power level up a notch and a half. Related to that, like we've been saying, there are so many recent sets that just do all kinds of cool artifact and enchantment stuff, so I'm interested in exploring that space a little bit, and I think I want to just sort of mush those two ideas together into whatever my next vague, difficult-to-explain cube is going to be.
So this is the first you've explained it to me at all, so still very synergy-driven, still avoiding kind of rigid archetypes per color pair, and requiring your players to come up with novel combinations of cards to get advantage over their opponents. A little more powerful and a little more focused on artifact enchantments?
Exactly.
Cool.
A couple other rules I might impose on myself. I might experiment with the no shuffling rule and just exclude fetch lands, just keep it faster gameplay. We'll see if I can
I think a
keep
no
myself to
shuffling
that.
cube is a really cool thing to do. And I have not been able to have the discipline to do it myself,
It's
but I
really
did do it
hard.
with my starter decks.
It takes a lot of discipline.
It is really hard. I did it with my starter decks, and I've loved it there. It makes things go so much faster. It really does.
It really does. And related to what we've been talking about, I was also thinking about how can I minimize tokens, and especially unique tokens, as much as possible. And I know I'm going to fail on that front as well, but yeah, these are just all kinds of things that are floating around in my head. The first thing I have here is, again, Blade of Shared Souls. I think that as much as I'm curious about playing this in an extremely sort of broken environment where it's going to do weird stuff, I think this card is just really interesting. I'd like to play it in a more fair environment where it's going to play as printed, as this clone that's going to give you opportunities to
Still pretty powerful, I think.
sculpt your board state. Yeah, for sure. Next up, Unctus Grand Metatect. Enjoy a Metatect as a treat. So this is 1 blue for a 2/4 legendary artifact creature, Phyrexian Vidalkin. Other blue creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. and other artifacts you control get +1/+1. It also has an activated ability for a Phyrexian blue mana. Until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other types. Activate that only as a sorcery. So this is just a big blue guy that lets you rummage or loot,
He's
rather.
not that big. He's a 2/4.
That's pretty big.
It's a yoked ox, right? Isn't that what it is?
Sure. Just lets you do a whole bunch of looting, which is something that I'm a big fan of. He pumps up artifacts, so I'm curious about sort of how much can we build this sort of artifact lord kind of pattern into here and make potentially pretty aggressive decks. It also has this fun thing where you can turn other things into artifacts, so it lets you sculpt your board and actually make use of those artifacts even if you don't end up having the right cards in the right time. So this is like a little bit more on the sort of complex side of the spectrum than I'm usually interested in, but I'm curious to see how it'll play.
Yoked ox is a 0/4 before people start writing me letters. That's what a yoked ox is. I don't know if there is a
Canonical 2/4?
canonical 2/4. I'm looking through all the 2/4s now, sorted by release date, looking at the earliest ones, and none of these jumping out at me as iconic. So maybe there is no iconic 2/4. Foot Soldiers from 9th edition, just a vanilla 2/4 for 4. What an awful card. Jeez. All right, what's next?
Next, Infested Flesh Cutter. I'm really just mining all of these blue-white artifact matter stuff. That's all I'm doing here.
Sure.
This is 1 and a white for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and whenever equipped creature attacks, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with toxic 1. Equip for 2 and a white. So, like we said up top, I'm not really interested in toxic. I'm not really interested in yet another new token type in my main cubes, but I do think this card is really cool because you equip it to something, it dies, and you get to put this equipment back onto your little might token that can't block, so you're just going to be happy to swing into combat and keep making this swarm of mites holding a sword, which we'll see if I end up cutting it, if I can actually hold to my lesser tokens restriction that I'd like to explore, but just overall I think that this is a card with a lot of interesting potential and interesting play patterns.
Yeah, seems cool. I'm into it.
Great.
I like this theme, too. I think, artifact cubes are just very cool. I think artifacts are a cool theme to explore, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have artifact themes in their cubes or a whole cube dedicated to artifacts. It's cool because they're inherently these little like kind of trinkety game pieces that oftentimes aren't like directly putting pressure on your opponent. They're kind of inherently synergistic, and I mean, at least prior to the past few years, they're inherently also open to almost any deck to play, which means that you get to combine things in weird ways. So I love that.
Yeah, so next up, I actually did this live edit, and I threw Malcator Purity Overseer in this list as well, because
Definitely fits.
It fits all of this perfectly. I also appreciate that it's a wizard. Something else I'd like to explore is, like in regular cube, I have a little bit of a zombie tribal theme. I think wizards are similarly one of the best tribal things that you can splash into a cube, because they have a very specific mechanical identity, as well as having a bunch of like lords and cards that care about wizards. So that's something else that just puts me over the edge of wanting to put Malcator in this list. That's not true. I was already over the edge. You talked me into it.
Can I make a small suggestion of Golem Tribal? Because I have wanted to try Golem Tribal a couple times before.
That's an easy sell. Right. Again, the token, the sticking to few or no tokens is really hard, but I do like golems.
The Golem thing is perfect because almost all of the splicers are just playable on their own, and then there are also so many incidental golems that just get a little better if you have splicers in your deck. That I think it's very cool.
Would you, in that context, consider Precursor Golem?
I think that would be the best payoff for that deck.
Excellent. Or the biggest risk.
Yeah, sure. That's true. But yes, I would play it because you got to live by the Precursor Golem and die by the Precursor Golem.
I'm going to put this on this list right now.
Also, golems are just cool.
All right, last two things I've got here is Mandible Justicar. This is 1 and a white for a 2/1 artifact creature, Phyrexian Cleric. It's got lifelink, and whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Just another simple, clean, pretty aggressive thing. I'm not a huge fan of lifelink, as you are also not, but I don't mind it on small creatures where you really, to get the benefit, have to work a little bit more from it. So I think this is going to be, again, a pretty clean fit for all this Artifact Matters stuff.
We've been playing with a little bit of Sheoldred lately. There's a Sheoldred in my cube right now. Sheoldred the
There are a couple
Apocalypse,
Sheoldreds around.
We played a cube on stream last week that is owned by a member of our play group that also featured Sheoldred. And I think you'll agree that Sheoldred feels absolutely oppressive. Like, it just feels so hard to beat when it's in play.
They did a really good job of designing that card to feel oppressive.
And I had the realization that absent other card draw, it's the same as having like a 2/2 flyer with lifelink.
Yes.
That's
correct.
why lifelink is so... lifelink is oppressive. It's oppressive, people.
Which is... the other card that it reminds me of is Clothis, which is another thing that you you despise that card. I know. I guess that's a Baneslayer that's also really hard to remove.
Yeah, Clothis you can't remove it, you can't interact with it at all. At least you can, try and force them to block with their Sheoldred, then you can, burn it out or something. Clothis just sits there and just gets you.
All right, another card here I've got is Barbed Batterfist. This is 1 and a red for an artifact equipment. It has 4 Mirrodin, and equipped creature gets a +1, -1, and has Equip 1. Power level's kind of all over the place in this list, which is not necessarily what this episode is for, but here we are anyway. I really like Mirrodin. I think it's a great twist on Living Weapon. I'm going to have to take a closer look at this, but this is just a 2-mana, 2/1 that has a fair amount of upside in being able to move that equipment around and potentially do interesting stuff with cards that care about power. Is definitely the kind of card that I'm always interested in. The only reason I didn't put this in the regular cube list is there's so many red 2-drops in there. I need to do a little bit of a culling there.
Drops, it's true.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to help with a culling if you ever want help with that.
Picture you literally tearing a Hobble Fiend to pieces.
Card is so bad. I don't like it. Are you considering a equipment sub-theme like the ones we've talked about in this cube? If you're going to care about artifacts and enchantments already, can you see yourself
absolutely
doing some equipment stuff?
Equipments are very cool. It sort of lets you reshape your game plan and combine your, literally in a way, just combine your cards to make them do more than the sum of their parts. Which,
yeah, it's a little bit of Voltron, a little bit of, artifact matters all mixed together. Well, cool, Anthony. I think your punishment for talking about an unfinished cube on this episode is that you have to submit a survey response for the unfinished cube.
Okay. Sometimes I forget to submit the surveys.
Okay, that's bad. You have to lead by example, Anthony. We ask people to spend so much of their time putting these surveys in. You got to do it yourself.
I spend so much time working on the survey, and then I forget I got to also do it.
Do you go and add your data afterwards when you forget to submit an answer?
No.
So if we check the historical answers to the surveys, you will not be responding to every single one of them?
It's happened before.
Wow. This is, you're about to get canceled, I think.
Tune in next week to see who's Andy's new co-host is.
All right, that leaves just the Bun Magic Cube for Phyrexia All-Be-One editions. I have very few editions too, Anthony, I gotta say. I've selected 6 cards here, but I would say 3 to 4 of them are probably not actually going to make the testing list, but they're so close that I think it's worth talking about them. Or at least it's I want to have mentioned it and say that I think it has potential, so if it pops off in 6 months, I can be like, I didn't totally overlook it. See, I thought maybe it had something there. First of those cards is Capricious Hellraiser. This is 3 red for a creature, Phyrexian Dragon. It's a 4/4, and it costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. It's a dragon, so it's got flying, and it says when Capricious Hellraiser enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard, choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. A very big, very capricious Snapcaster Mage, basically. This feels to me in a, adjacent to Bedlam Reveler style space, and Bedlam Reveler is a card I put in my cube. Well, it's been in and out, but I put it back in my cube sometime last year, and have been pretty happy with it. It has a crazy high ceiling. That card is occasionally a 2-mana, 3/4 prowess, draw 3 cards, which is absolutely nuts. But it also has this tension of being counter-synergistic with Delve cards, counter-synergistic with your Grim Lavamancers. You have to sort of sequence things in the right way to make it work, and when it's bad, it's literally uncastable. You just have a card in your hand you can't play. So it's definitely been kind of swingy, but a card I've enjoyed playing with. I think this is in kind of a similar space. The fact that it's 3 red and always 3 red is a big commitment. The double red on Bedlam Reveler is already kind of a big commitment, and this is, 50% more of a commitment. And then it's also entirely possible for you to just completely whiff on that enter the battlefield ability, which is going to feel pretty bad. So I don't think I'm in for this, but anytime I see a spells matter, cost reduction, big flyer, it's it sets off a little bell in my head of could this possibly get there?
The ceiling is really high. I think the tension is also interesting that you obviously want to get a bunch of cards into your graveyard so that you can make it much cheaper, but when you do, it's making the ability worse because you have more cards that are potentially not going to be... You don't have the same amount of control, which I think is positive kind of tension.
Yeah, I think the tension's always interesting. The question of whether or not it makes a card too risky for players to want to play. I think Bedlam Reveler's in that camp where some people just won't play it because sometimes it's going to be bad and I don't want that risk in my deck, and that's what... They have a full right as a player to do that. Other players will play it, and then they'll feel the power when they get to actually put it all together. But it definitely does have a sequencing kind of challenge associated with it. So Anyway, Capricious Hellraiser. Probably not going to get there, but kind of interesting. This next one I'm sure nobody would ever think I would call out, but it's Anoint with Affliction. It's a common removal spell, 1 and a black for an instant. Exile target creature if it has mana value 3 or less, and then it has Corrupted, exile it completely if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. Ignore the corrupted text. I have no poison in my cube, so that will never be relevant. Just a smother that exiles, I think, is pretty darn good in my cube. I have a very low curve. The vast majority of my threats are 3 mana and below, and the recursiveness of threats, things like Kroxa, things like Uro, has been noted before. It's been observed of this cube that the recursive threats can really be dominant. So being able to exile any of those things for just 2 mana, I think makes this pretty compelling. This is on my short list of cards I intend on trying if I do want to add more exile removal. It's up there with Magma.
Magma Spray is the 1 for 2 damage. 1 mana, 2 damage, exile.
I think it's one that can also do damage to players, because Magma Spray is only creatures.
Right.
I gotta figure it out, sorry. Pillar of Flame. It's up there with cards like Pillar of Flame or Magma Spray, which are 2, shock variants that exile that I would be interested in trying if I went that route. Though in some ways I think those cards can't exile a Kroxa or an Uro. I guess actually they can, because if they would die instead, you exile it, so you just put 2 damage on it in response to the triggered ability if it's going to go to the graveyard because it wasn't escaped. But weird edge case. Anyway, I think this card is actually pretty good and easy to overlook because it is kind of similar to lots of cards we've had in the past, but if your cube is really low curving and you have a lot of recursive stuff like mine, this might be worth consideration. And it's definitely on my list of cards I'm going to I put it on my baby board on Cube Cobra so that if I find this problem continues to persist or I want to add more removal against recursive stuff, it's on the short list to get there.
If the recursive threats persist?
Yeah, baby.
So, obviously it has this line of text that just literally will not matter in your cube. How much of a negative is that to you?
Pretty big negative.
Okay.
Pretty big.
So it doesn't mean it's, if it does enough other stuff that it is a good game piece, you're going to play it, but it's a big negative.
Yep. That's where I'm at.
Fair.
Next up is another 2-mana removal spell. It's Ossification. 1 and a white for an enchantment aura. Enchant basic land you control. When Ossification enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. It's basically a Journey to Nowhere that can hit planeswalkers that requires you to have a basic land in play. In my environment, there is, I think, exactly 1 way to destroy a basic land, and it's Vindicate. And I guess that could come up, and that would be a huge bummer, but mostly this is going to be a Journey to Nowhere. You'll have to actually get rid of the enchantment itself, because you can't really deal with the basic land. I don't know. I don't love these kinds of effects. It is a 2-mana way. Journey to Nowhere is a card that has been on the cusp of my cube for a long time. I historically don't love these kind of O-ring effects, because I do feel like it's such a blowout if it does get answered. Though I will say, that has been my log line for those cards for a long time. I'm down to very, very few disenchant effects in my cube because there are so few artifacts and enchantments that actually matter to remove. Those effects are just too narrow. So the chance you actually will get to remove it is that much slimmer. And if you do get to, it's going to be with something like Abrupt Decay or Vindicate, which to me feels less bad because that's a real spell as opposed to turning on the enter the battlefield trigger
as opposed to Reclamation Sage.
Exactly, like a Reclamation Sage or something that's just incidentally haha, incidentally I blow you out.
Dunking on Reclamation Sage.
I mean, it's just not a play pattern that I really enjoy. So this is closer to consideration. I actually don't think I need more removal, which is why it's still in this cusp of cards of I'm probably not going to touch this, but it did jump out at me.
I really don't like the logistics of these kinds of cards.
Yeah, the fact that you have to put it on your basic land, in by your lands, is really annoying. It's harder to track.
It just makes a weird sort of pile on the table, and I think that in a lot of environments where there is some land destruction, I feel like that it was done this way for flavor reasons, not because land destruction should be relevant to destroy the spell. So I would say
I think the restriction of a basic land is interesting because it does mean that if you're playing a 4 or 5 color deck, you just can't necessarily jam this.
I don't know. To me, a lot of that just feels more arbitrary than interesting. I would say that of all the 2-mana removal spells, I'd much rather just have Journey to Nowhere for its simplicity.
Yeah, probably. I'm also on not as many planeswalkers as I used to be, but I noted this card when I saw it printed.
It's definitely notable. I mean, it is powerful, and I think a lot of people are going to end up playing it.
Yeah. So those 3 I don't think I'm actually going to end up playing, especially because those last 2 are kind of known quantities. I know exactly what they would do in my environment. If I want more of that effect in the future, these are available to me. These last 3, there's one I'm really excited about, which I'll save till the end. There are 2 here that I am interested in and probably will test because I'm curious to see how they will play. And the first is one that I don't think I've seen anybody else talking about. It's Nahiri the Unforgiving. It's going to be very hard to read this card's rules text and mana value on air. So it's 1 red-white plus a Phyrexian red or white. So you can either pay 1 red-white to cast this spell, or you can play 1 red-red-white or 1 red-white-white. And has completed, which means that if you pay the 4 mana with actual mana instead of life, it comes into play with 2 additional loyalty counters on it. Or it's the opposite. It's 2 less if you pay the Phyrexia mana with life, but you get the idea. It has a +1 that says until your next turn, up to 1 target creature attacks a player each combat if able. It has another +1, discard a card, then draw a card. And it has a 0, exile target creature or equipment card with mana value less than Nahiri's loyalty from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it. That token gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. It's that last ability that I'm excited about that I think is kind of cool. I think in some sort of aggro deck, being able to for free unearth something from your graveyard without paying any mana and just get to attack with it in the late game is going to be a beating. You're just going to get, your best thing in your graveyard back every single turn and keep hitting them with it, which is also going to make their blocks kind of complicated. I think it's actually a cool and compelling top end for a red-white deck. I also do really like the +1 to discard a card, then draw a card, because if you are Hellbent, it's just +1 draw a card, because
you have
no cards to discard, and in a really low-to-the-ground red-white deck, you being Hellbent is not out of the question. I think the other +1 is largely a distraction. I can't see playing a deck where I would care about that much. I guess in certain races, just getting rid of one of their blockers and taking a hit from it so you can attack past it might be relevant. Obviously, the best case for this is that you have big blockers that you can force them to sacrifice attack something into, but in a red-white deck, I don't think that's going to happen much in my cube. So I don't know.
It also means that creature can't attack Nahiri, right? Because it says attacks a target player.
Yeah, it is a kind of protection for Nahiri, but honestly, I don't expect any players to attack Nahiri, to be frank. The fact that this card doesn't have any kind of ultimate or anything, and I don't think its 0 is going to get a whole lot better in my cube, at least if you're at 4 or 5 versus 3, because my threats are so low to the ground. I think it's going to be a thing people are just going to more or less put up with and say that's an enchantment you have now. It does this every turn. It actually reminds me a little bit of, do you know the white enchantment that every turn makes a copy of a creature you control and then exiles it on end step, but it doesn't give it haste? Seance. It actually kind of gives me Seance vibes, which is a cool build around from back in the day that would allow you to, every upkeep, I think, make a copy of one of the creatures in your graveyard, and then it would leave the play at the end of the turn, but it didn't give it haste, and it was kind of confusing for players that were like, what does this card even do? And the answer
is... It's just a Seance. You just make some ghosts.
The answer is it does things with enter the battlefield abilities or leave the battlefield abilities, and I'm pretty sure that one doesn't exile, so you can just do it with the same thing over and over again, I think. I'm not actually fully familiar with the rule sets of Seance, but I think that 0 ability is really appealing, and for only 3 mana, it's potentially kind of cool. That's a card I'm interested in trying out because I'm curious to see what it would do. I don't think it's like a slam dunk in my cube, but I think it has potential, and for that reason, kind of interesting.
I think especially it being a multicolored card that you want in aggressive decks, it makes sense as a top end. You're potentially playing mostly red or mostly white, but this is something that's sort of worth splashing because you're more likely to have your fixing a little bit later in the game, and this is just going to generate a ton of value. But also it does have the modality that maybe you do just cast this on turn 3, it ticks up to 3 loyalty, and then you start to do stuff with it. It does a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you could also just rummage with it. You're not hellbent, but you just have cards you don't want. You drew too many lands or whatever. You can just start rummaging with it. I think it's kind of cool.
I think that other +1 is going to come up more than you're giving credit, though. I think the fact that you're playing a creature and then your opponent has some utility thing. Oftentimes, the utility stuff that you want to destroy is stuff like Mother of Runes or Elves, which are likely to be tapped anyway. So I'd be curious how often it does come up, but I think it's going to be a non-zero amount of times.
I'd be surprised, but yeah, it'll come up sometimes. I mean, that's the value of these abilities that are long tail abilities.
Yeah.
I think people are maybe evaluating this card differently from me, though, because they're looking at that as one of the primary things to do, and I'm expecting to barely ever do that.
Interesting, yeah.
I'm expecting to pretty much just zero it unless I really need to rummage or I'm hellbent and just want to draw a card. But it almost feels to me like the sort of uncommon war planeswalker space, where it has no ultimate, it's not producing any tokens, it's not making the board cluttered. Well, I mean, it technically is producing tokens of things in your graveyard.
It literally makes
tokens. You know
tokens.
what I mean, though? It's not cluttering the board, it's not prolonging the game, it's just this kind of utility card that has the trade-off of being able to be attacked if your opponents want to get rid of the utility card, which I prefer so much more over a Seance where they have to have a disenchant to interact with it. This is like an enchantment they can interact with if they choose to, which I think is kind of cool.
Sure.
The other card I'm really interested in, but not sure of where it's going to land, is Mercurial Spelldancer. 1 and a blue for a creature Phyrexian Rogue. It is a 2/1 that can't be blocked. Pretty good off the bat, I must say. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and whenever Mercurial Spelldancer deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy.
Cool. Copying spells is fun.
Copying spells is fun. This plays in the same space as a Seagate Stormcaller, I think. I've seen people comparing this to a like Dreadhorde Arcanist in Legacy, in that you have to spend no additional mana to copy that spell, right? You gotta do some other stuff. You gotta attack with your 2-drop, but that's exactly what Dreadhorde Arcanist asked of you. No mana value restriction on the thing you're casting, so, you gotta cast it, but once it's on the stack, you can just copy it. I love Dreadhorde Arcanist, and honestly, I think it was Aspiring Spike I saw compare this to Dreadhorde Arcanist on Twitter, and that alone was like, I have to test this to see how it plays. I don't like things that can't be blocked for the same reason I don't like things that can't block. It's like, it just removes interactivity, and this might as well be like a thing that just taxes your opponent by 2 life every turn that can eat, a lava dart. But the fact that you can copy these spells, copying spells is fun, and it's a cheap card that, will contribute to sort of tempo gameplay that I like in my low to the ground blue decks. I'm back! The costs of recording this episode early on in spoiler season, I hadn't fully processed this card. I think I was kind of processing it live on air, and the more I think about this card, the more excited I get about it. I think some people are missing that when you copy a spell, that is also going to put another oil counter on the Spelldancer. So it essentially is going to copy every other spell you cast as long as you can keep hitting with it, which is really good. I also really like that this kind of runs counter to the Dreadhorde Arcanist style effects in that it rewards you for playing bigger spells, right? Because again, you can copy anything once it's on the stack, whereas Dreadhorde Arcanist, you want as many 1-mana value spells as possible so you can guarantee that you can keep getting some value on it when you attack turn after turn. This is like, cast your Fractured Identity or your Mystic Confluence or some big spell. I mean, you could double up on Fiery Confluence and deal 12 to your opponent. So I think it actually has a comparably high ceiling to Arcanist, but it's going to play in kind of a different way that I'm excited about. It's also just a 2-mana removal check, which I do like Baneslayers. I've been trying to put more in the cube, and given that this is unblockable, the only way to interact with it is going to be to remove it. So I still don't love that line of text, but it is going to contribute to a type of card I've been looking for more of in my cube. Also, even if I had said all of this during the initial record of this episode, I would have to edit in a little addendum here to say that Brian Koval, aka Bosch and Roll, has coined the terminology oiling it up when you trigger this card. So, cast your Mishra's Bauble and oil up your Spelldancer. And that's a little brainworm that will never leave my head, whether I like it or not. And so now it's in yours as well. How do you rate this on power level? Would you be excited to put this in your deck as a player?
I would definitely try it. I mean, I think the ceiling is really high. If you get to copy a couple spells, that's a lot of value, but it does take a little bit of time and setup. So
yeah,
I would definitely give it a try. I mean, I'll always put cheap spells in my deck in this environment.
I mean, part of what I like about Dreadhorde Arcanist is that, like, if this were a 1-3 rather than a 2-1 that can't be blocked, I'd be more interested in it because you're asking your opponent to block it with something real, right? Which means you can potentially keep blockers that can kill it off the battlefield, but you don't have this, like, free roll to attack. I don't know. I'm interested. It could be kind of cool. The card I'm most excited about by far, Anthony, it's not in Phyrexia All-Be-One.
Oh, my goodness.
It's in Phyrexia All-Be-One Commander. I think it is super sick. It's Glimmer Lens. 1 and a white for an artifact equipment with Firmiridan. Which means it enters the battlefield attached to a 2/2 red token. Whenever equipped creature and at least one other creature attack, draw a card and equipped for 1 and a white. This card is very good.
Yeah, card seems extremely powerful.
Perfect example of like a commander card that would be a huge problem in Retail Limited if you got to just play a bear that drew cards when you attack with it. Commander is obviously a very different environment, but I think in 1-on-1 this is really powerful, and it's powerful in a cool way because it lets your aggressive decks also not totally sacrifice the late game to keep their plan on. Like, this will definitely encourage you to make attacks where you're going to lose one of your creatures because you want to draw that card immediately and keep pushing damage through. The fact that you can move it around to equip it to stuff, you put it on a flyer or something, so it's a little bit safer when it's attacking. I think it's just really cool. It's a really cool card that is going to make me look even harder now for other kinds of subtle artifact payoffs I can possibly put in my cube, because there's just enough artifacts now that are just incidental, right? Your Esper Sentinel, this kind of thing. There's stuff that I'm just playing now that are just artifacts because they've printed so many good artifacts recently that I want like one other like cool artifact payoff maybe. 2-mana 2/2 is a perfectly fine base rate if you never get to trigger this thing. This is even better. It's 2-mana 2/2 that leaves behind an equipment if it dies. So that's something. And I think you're going to trigger it a lot. I mean, just attacking with 2 creatures is not that big of an ask in an aggro deck. Yeah. And then you just start drawing cards.
Yeah, I mean, I love a good bear with set mechanic.
That's it for the regular cube. Not a whole lot here.
Regular cube?
Either.
You mean the Bun Magic Cube?
That's it for the Bun Magic Cube. Not a lot here for me either, but I'm interested in these 3 cards, and there's certainly a couple of good bread and butter effects like Anoint with Affliction and Ossification that I might decide to tap into in the future, potentially. But really, it's those 3 cards I'm most interested in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool set, but like we said, there's a lot going on that feels a little bit more isolated, so I expect that we might see a lot more thematic cubes that are really dipping deeper into this set. But as for our more established cubes, there's, just a couple little things here and there that contribute to the kind of themes that we're focusing on there.
Glimmer Lens is sick, though.
I still think this mushroom is cool.
Esper Sentinel and Smuggler's Copter and Glimmer Lens. You got
Esper Sentinel, that's the thing that I want to make a Nahiri attack, although probably they'll be in the same deck.
You want to make attack Nahiri, you mean? Or
yeah.
Use Nahiri to make attack your... Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that could
That's
come
like
up.
the kind of utility creature that makes
If you're the
sense
aggro deck, you're not worried about Esper Sentinel, though.
I'm always worried about Esper Sentinel. I go to sleep worrying about Esper Sentinel.
All right. That's it for this episode. Last one was a little short. This one's a little long. It all comes out in the wash. This is certainly going to be your last call to respond to our Phyrexia All Be One surveys. They're on our website and linked in the show notes. So get your answers in before part 3 of our set review, which will be us reviewing the answers from the community and talking about the cards people are most excited about. And I often forget to mention it, but we are accepting voice memo hot takes. So if you have a particularly interesting take on a card from Phyrexia All Be One or the associated Commander product, you can send that voice memo to mail@luckypaper.co or drop it to me on Twitter or Discord or wherever we are in touch. And we'll include those in our episodes so that it's not just our opinions on the community set review. It's about the community. This is also the last episode that will come out before we will be in Philadelphia for MagicCon, so come hang out with us, meet us there. Well, you can catch us in Discords if you want to meet up. There's people organizing in the CubeCon Discord. There's people organizing in the Cube Talk Discord. People organizing all the Discords we're in. We'll also probably post a picture of us on Twitter or something so you can see what we're wearing that day and come up and harass us.
Probably gray.
All my clothes are gray.
Mm-hmm.
You're wearing a really dark gray right now.
It's a really dark gray with a lot of copper.
Yes, a lot of
From
Sadie's hair.
your
Yes,
dog.
She's disgusting. I apologize. On that bombshell, that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, writing all sorts of different Scryfall filters and searches to help us parse through a set so we can speak into microphones about it. Thanks for doing that with me, Anthony.
I love doing a lot of detailed Scryfall searches, so
Yeah.
happy to do it.